Dust devils danced across the barren Nevada hills as three armed riders approached the ramshackle mining claim, their eyes fixed on the stooped figure panning for gold in the creek below. They couldn't have known that the weathered old prospector, his hands trembling slightly as he worked his pan, was once known as Ghost Eye Matthews, the deadliest marksman in the Pacific Campaign, with more confirmed kills than any other Allied sniper. Their mistake would be their last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky slopes of Rattlesnake Canyon, its harsh light casting deep shadows among the twisted junipers and sage. The three riders approached slowly, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust that hung motionless in the still air. Leading the group was Jack Hawkins, a man whose reputation for brutality had spread across 3 territories, his face bearing a distinctive burn scar that twisted his left cheek into a permanent sneer. Behind him rode his younger brother Cole, whose quick trigger finger had left a trail of widows from Sacramento to Denver. The third rider, a young man barely out of his teens who called himself Quick Tommy Walsh, shifted nervously in his saddle. He joined the Hawkins gang just 2 months ago, drawn by tales of easy riches and the promise of becoming something more than another dirt-poor ranch hand. Now, watching the old miner methodically working his pan in the creek below, Tommy felt the first stirrings of unease. There was something about the way the old man moved, a precision that seemed at odds with his apparent frailty. Inside the crude log cabin that overlooked the creek, Sarah Chen watched through a carefully concealed spy hole, her young hands steady on the Winchester Model 70 that James Matthews had taught her to use. The 16-year-old daughter of Chinese immigrants had found an unlikely mentor in the quiet veteran who'd taken over the abandoned mining claim 2 years ago. To the outside world, he appeared to be just another broken-down prospector chasing dreams of gold in these unforgiving hills. Only Sarah knew the truth. More likely to strike iron than gold in that creek, Jack Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness that had preceded violence countless times before. The old miner looked up slowly, squinting against the sun, his weathered hands continuing their methodical movement through the creek-bed gravel. James Matthews had chosen this location carefully when he'd arrived in Rattlesnake Canyon. The steep walls, the twisted arroyos, the seemingly random placement of his cabin and outbuildings, every element had been selected with the eye of a man who had spent years studying terrain and angles, who understood how to turn a landscape into a weapon. "Ain't found much," Matthews replied, his voice carrying the slight tremor that most assumed came from age or too much cheap whiskey. In reality, it was shrapnel from Okinawa that had damaged his vocal cords, leaving him with a perpetual quaver that had served his cover well these past 2 years. Barely enough color to keep body and soul together. Sarah watched as the Hawkins brothers exchanged knowing looks. The gang's reputation had grown over the past year as they systematically targeted isolated mining claims across the territory. Their method was always the same: approach under the guise of friendly interest, assess the target's defenses, then strike without mercy. They couldn't have known that they were following a script James Matthews had anticipated and prepared for months ago. "Mind if we water our horses?" Cole, Hawkins asked, already dismounting without waiting for permission. His spurs rang against the rocky ground as he moved closer to the creek, deliberately positioning himself to block any line of retreat. "Been riding since dawn." Matthews nodded slowly, carefully setting his pan aside. Sarah noted how his hands, which had seemed to tremble as he worked the creek bed, were now perfectly steady. She remembered his lessons about deception, about how the best cover wasn't just about appearance, but about understanding human nature. "Help yourselves," Matthews offered, his voice carrying just the right note of resigned hospitality. "Got coffee on the fire too, if you've a mind." The Hawkins brothers shared another look, this one carrying darker intent. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted, found himself studying the old miner more carefully. Something about the way the man held himself, even stooped and apparently frail, triggered warnings in the back of his mind. But before he could process these thoughts, Jack Hawkins had already begun the next phase of their usual routine. "Mighty generous of you, old-timer," Jack said, swinging down from his saddle. "Don't mind if we do. Been hearing interesting things about this claim. They say the original owner pulled out quite a bit of color before he disappeared." Matthews shuffled slightly, adjusting his position in a way that seemed random, but actually gave him clearer lines of sight to all three men. "That's so," he replied mildly. "Ain't seen much evidence of it myself." The wind picked up suddenly, sending another dust devil dancing across the canyon floor. To most observers, the scene would have appeared ordinary. Three dusty riders, sharing water and conversation with an aging prospector. They couldn't have known they were standing in carefully planned killing zones, that every seemingly natural feature of the landscape had been modified and prepared over months of patient work. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews hadn't died in the Pacific as most believed. It had simply gone into hiding, waiting for the moment when his particular skills would be needed again. As the Hawkins brothers moved closer, their intentions as clear as the desert sky above, that moment was rapidly approaching. Sarah shifted position slightly, remembering everything Matthews had taught her about patience, about waiting for the perfect moment. The Winchester in her hands was ready, but, like her mentor, she understood that timing was everything. The next few minutes would transform this peaceful mining claim into something very different, and the Hawkins gang was about to learn why some legends are better left undisturbed. To understand the full weight of what was about to unfold in Rattlesnake Canyon, we must return to a time when James Matthews wore a different kind of mantle. The year was 1943, and the jungles of the Pacific Theater had become a hunting ground where survival depended on patience, precision, and the ability to become one with the terrain. Before he became the stooped figure panning for non-existent gold, Matthews had been part of an elite group of Marine Corps sharpshooters. His instructors had recognized something rare in the quiet farm boy from Montana, an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and calculate distances, combined with the patience of a born hunter. These skills would transform him into something more than just another skilled marksman. The nickname Ghost Eye hadn't come from his accuracy, though his confirmed kills would eventually set records that remained classified. It came from his uncanny ability to find positions that others deemed impossible, to materialize like a phantom where no shooter should have been able to reach. Japanese officers had placed bounties on his head, never realizing that the man they hunted had learned to hide in plain sight long before he ever picked up a rifle. Sarah Chen had discovered the truth about Matthews by accident. One morning, arriving early to begin her daily lessons, she had found him cleaning a customized M1903 Springfield rifle, his movements displaying the kind of intimate familiarity that comes only from years of experience. Instead of hiding the weapon, Matthews had recognized something in the young girl's eyes, the same hunger for knowledge, the same patience that his instructors had seen in him decades ago. Perfect accuracy, he had told her during their first real lesson, isn't about natural talent. It's about understanding that every shot begins long before you touch the trigger. He had taught her to read the wind, to calculate distances instinctively, to understand how terrain could be both ally and enemy. More importantly, he had taught her why these skills mattered beyond mere survival. Now, watching the Hawkins gang, Through her spy hole, Sarah remembered another lesson. The most dangerous predators, Matthews had said, are the ones who think their prey is helpless. The gang's reputation had grown precisely because they targeted those who seemed vulnerable: isolated miners, elderly prospectors, lonely homesteaders. They had become experts at recognizing weakness, but had never learned to look deeper. A letter had arrived last month from the territorial marshal, carried by a trusted courier. It had confirmed what Matthews had already suspected. The Hawkins brothers weren't just common bandits. They were part of a larger organization, one that used small-time raids to cover more sophisticated operations. The disappearance of the claim's previous owner hadn't been random violence. He had discovered something in these hills that certain powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Matthews had spent the past 2 years building his cover with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made him a legend in the Pacific. Every tremor in his hands, every stoop in his walk, every apparent sign of age and weakness had been carefully calculated. The few nuggets of gold he periodically showed in town were planted, part of a larger deception designed to draw exactly the kind of attention he now had. The canyon itself had become an extension of his art. What looked like random debris around the cabin was carefully positioned to channel movement. The seemingly haphazard placement of his mining equipment created natural firing lanes. Even the creek bed where he now stood had been subtly modified, its banks shaped to provide cover while appearing completely natural. Sarah shifted position, again moving to another observation point with the silent grace Matthews had taught her. Her father owned the general store in the nearby town of Red Rock, and like many Chinese merchants of the era, he had faced his share of threats and discrimination. Matthews had begun teaching her more than just marksmanship. He had shown her how to protect herself and her family without escalating violence, how to use intelligence and preparation to avoid conflict where possible. But there were times, he had explained, when conflict became inevitable. The key was to control when and where it happened. The Hawkins gang had chosen this isolated canyon, thinking it offered them privacy for their crimes. They couldn't have known that every aspect of the terrain had been prepared to turn their own tactics against them. The most telling detail of Matthew's preparation wasn't in the physical alterations to the landscape, but in the network of allies he had quietly built. Sarah wasn't his only student. The regular supply runs from town, the occasional prospectors who passed through sharing news, even the old Apache scout who sometimes brought game meat. Each was part of a carefully constructed web of surveillance and support. The best position, Matthews had taught Sarah, isn't always the highest ground. It's the ground your enemy doesn't think to watch. As if to emphasize this lesson, the Hawkins brothers continued their approach, seeing only what they expected to see: a vulnerable old miner whose claim might hide valuable secrets. They had become so accustomed to finding easy prey that they had forgotten the most important rule of hunting. Sometimes the prey is actually the hunter. In the 2 years since claiming this isolated patch of Nevada territory, James Matthews had created something unique. A fortress that didn't look like a fortress, a defensive position that appeared completely defenseless. Every apparent sign of vulnerability had been carefully crafted to draw attention away from the true strength that lay beneath the surface. The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked rock. To the Hawkins gang, it was just another hot day in an endless series of raids. To James Matthews, it was the culmination of years of patience, the moment when all his careful preparation would serve a purpose beyond mere survival. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews was about to remind these men why some targets are better left unpursued. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The September heat had transformed Rattlesnake Canyon into a crucible of sun-bleached stone and shimmering air. James Matthews maintained his carefully crafted pose of vulnerability as the Hawkins brothers drew closer, their boots crunching on the creek-bed gravel. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen's finger rested lightly against the Winchester's trigger guard, just as Matthews had taught her. Ready, but patient. Alert, but controlled. "Interesting setup you've got here, old-timer," Jack Hawkins commented, his eyes sweeping across the claim with the practiced assessment of a predator. "Must be hard working a place like this all alone." The gang leader's scarred face twisted into what might have been meant as a friendly smile, but the expression never reached his cold eyes. Matthews straightened slowly, his movements deliberately stiff and arthritic. "Man learns to make do," he replied, his voice carrying the quaver that had become part of his cover. "Ain't much, but it's peaceful." The irony of his words hung in the hot air, unnoticed by the Hawkins gang, but causing Sarah to tighten her grip slightly on the Winchester. Cole Hawkins had begun circling wider, attempting to flank the old miner's position while maintaining the pretense of casual movement. His spurs rang against stone as he approached one of the abandoned mining equipment piles that dotted the claim. What he saw as potential cover had actually been positioned precisely to channel movement into prepared fields of fire. "Peaceful's good," Jack Hawkins agreed, moving closer to Matthews. "But peace can be expensive these days. Lot of bad elements around. Maybe you could use some protection." The threat in his words was clear, following the gang's usual pattern of escalating intimidation before violence. Young Tommy Walsh remained mounted, his nervous energy making his horse shift restlessly. Something about the situation felt wrong to him, though he couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was the way the old miner's eyes moved, tracking their positions with a precision that seemed at odds with his apparent frailty. "Protection," Matthews repeated, adding a slight tremor to his hands as he set down his gold pan. "Reckon a man my age ain't got much worth protecting." His words carried exactly the right note of resignation and fear, but inside he was calculating angles and distances with the same lethal accuracy that had once made him a legend in the Pacific. Jack Hawkins laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. "Oh, I wouldn't say that. Word is the last fellow working this claim found something interesting before he, moved on. Something worth quite a bit to the right people." His hand dropped casually to rest on his holstered revolver. Sarah watched through her spy hole as Matthews shifted positions slightly, the movement appearing random, but actually placing him in a better tactical position. She remembered his lessons about the moment before violence erupts, how to read the signs in men's faces and bodies. Violence has a language, he had taught her. Learn to read it, and you'll never be truly surprised. Ain't found nothing like that myself," Matthews replied, his trembling hands now steady as they moved closer to the worn prospector's jacket he wore. What looked like patches and repairs actually concealed carefully positioned tools that could serve multiple purposes, just enough color to keep going. Cole Hawkins had completed his circuit, positioning himself behind what he thought was the old miner's only route of escape. "Maybe you ain't been looking in the right places," he suggested, his voice carrying the same false friendliness as his brother's. "Maybe you need some experienced help." The tension in the canyon had reached a critical point. Sarah could see it in the way the Hawkins brothers moved, in the nervous shifting of young Tommy's horse. Matthews had explained this moment to her during their lessons. The pause before a storm breaks, when violence hangs in the air like lightning waiting to strike. "Might be you're right about that," Matthews conceded, his voice still carrying its careful quaver. "Ain't as young as I used to be, getting harder to work these claims proper." Each word was calculated to reinforce their assumptions about his vulnerability while positioning himself exactly where he needed to be. Jack Hawkins moved closer, his confidence growing with each step. Tell you what, old-timer, why don't you show us around your operation? Maybe we can come to some kind of arrangement. His hand remained on his revolver, a gesture that had preceded death for many others in similar situations. The sun had reached its zenith, eliminating most shadows and creating the kind of harsh light that Matthews had specifically chosen this time of day for. Every aspect of the confrontation, from the timing to the positioning, had been carefully orchestrated through months of preparation. "Arrangement?" Matthews asked, adding a slight shuffle to his feet that actually moved him into perfect position. What kind of arrangement would that be? His apparent confusion masked the lethal precision of a man who had once calculated wind speeds and distances while watching enemy officers through his scope. Sarah's breath steadied as she observed the scene unfolding below. Matthews had taught her that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was not when violence erupted, but in the seconds just before, when the right action could still prevent bloodshed. But he had also taught her that some men choose violence, no matter what, and for those men, the only response was to be better prepared and more skilled than they could imagine. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews was about to resurface in Rattlesnake Canyon, not with the dramatic flash of a movie hero, but with the calculated precision of a man who had learned that true skill lies in controlling every aspect of a confrontation. Before it begins, the Hawkins gang, confident in their assessment of an easy target, was about to learn why some legends are remembered not for how many they killed, but for how completely they controlled the battlefield. The confrontation in Rattlesnake Canyon had reached that delicate moment when time seems to slow, each second stretching like molten glass. James Matthews recognized this pause, having experienced it countless times in the Pacific Theater. It was the moment when men's choices became irrevocable, when violence, once initiated, would follow its inevitable course. "Here's the arrangement," Jack Hawkins announced, his scarred face twisting into something that barely resembled a smile. "You're going to show us exactly where the old owner was digging before his unfortunate accident. Then you're going to tell us about every conversation you've had with that marshal who visited last month." His hand tightened on his revolver grip. Matthews allowed a flicker of surprise to cross his weathered features, the expression perfectly calculated. "Marshal," he repeated, his voice carrying just the right note of confusion. "Don't recall any marshal." The tremor in his voice had subtly changed, though. No longer the quaver of age, but something that would have been familiar to any veteran of the Pacific campaign. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen watched as the subtle signals she had learned to recognize began to appear. Matthews had taught her that combat wasn't just about weapons and accuracy. It was about reading the environment, understanding the psychological state of your opponents, and controlling the pace of events. "Don't play dumb, old man," Cole Hawkins snarled, his patience wearing thin. "We've been watching this claim. We know about the night visitor, about those letters you've been sending to town." He moved closer, his spurs ringing against stone in a rhythm that he thought projected menace, but actually helped Matthews track his position without looking. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted, felt his unease growing. Something about the old miner's posture had changed, a straightening so subtle it was almost imperceptible. "Mr. Hawkins," he started to say, but Jack cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You see, friend," Jack continued, his voice carrying the false warmth that had preceded violence so many times before, "we've got interests in this canyon. Important. People backing us who want to make sure certain things stay quiet." His hand moved to draw his revolver, a motion he had practiced countless times. Matthews appeared to shrink slightly, his shoulders hunching in what seemed to be fear. But Sarah, watching through her carefully positioned spy hole, recognized the movement for what it was. Her mentor shifting into one of the modified firing stances he had developed during the war, one that appeared vulnerable while actually providing maximum stability and coverage. "Might be," Matthews said slowly, his trembling hands now rock-steady, "that you boys ought to consider walking away from this one." The quaver in his voice had disappeared entirely, replaced by something harder, something that made Tommy Walsh's horse shift nervously. Jack Hawkins laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. "Or what, old-timer? You'll throw your gold pan at us?" He drew his revolver with the speed that had made him feared throughout the territory. "Last chance to make this easy on yourself." "Funny thing about last chances," Matthews replied, his voice now carrying echoes of distant battlefields, "is knowing exactly when you're getting one." His movement was so subtle that even Sarah, trained to watch for it, almost missed the moment, when the worn prospector's jacket fell away to reveal the carefully modified holster beneath. Cole Hawkins, thinking he had the advantage of position, started to draw his own weapon. "Enough talk," he began, but the words died in his throat as he noticed something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Every piece of mining equipment, every pile of rocks, every seemingly random feature of the claim had been positioned to create perfect firing lanes. "You know what they taught us in the Marines?" Matthews asked, his voice carrying the same calm certainty that had once made him a legend in the Pacific. "That the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see. It's the one who's been watching you, learning your patterns, waiting for you to walk right into their sights." The transformation was complete now. The stooped old miner had vanished, replaced by something that made even Jack Hawkins' practiced bravado falter. Gone was the trembling prospector, and in his place stood a man whose every movement spoke of lethal precision. "Last chance," Matthews offered, echoing Jack's words, but with an entirely different weight behind them. "Walk away. Forget about this claim, about the marshal, about whatever your important people are trying to keep quiet. Live to see another sunset." Sarah's finger remained steady on the Winchester's trigger guard, remembering Matthew's lessons about patience and timing. She could see the moment of decision approaching in the way the Hawkins brothers shifted their weight, in the growing terror on young Tommy's face as he finally recognized what they were facing. Ghost Eye Matthews hadn't earned his nickname just for accuracy. It had come from his ability to control every aspect of a confrontation, to turn terrain and timing into weapons more deadly than any rifle. The Hawkins gang had walked into a trap 2 years in the making, every step of their approach calculated and accounted for long before they ever entered Rattlesnake Canyon. The legend was about to remind these men why some reputations are earned not through boasting or quick draws, but through the kind of patience that transforms a battlefield into a carefully orchestrated dance of position and precision. The next few moments would demonstrate why some targets, no matter how seemingly vulnerable, are better left unpursued. The stillness in Rattlesnake Canyon was absolute, the kind of silence that falls just before violence erupts. Jack Hawkins' revolver caught the harsh sunlight, but his usual confidence had been replaced by something unfamiliar: doubt. The transformation they had just witnessed, from trembling old prospector to deadly veteran, had shaken even his practiced bravado. "You're bluffing, old man," Jack managed, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty that his younger brother immediately detected. 1 against 3 isn't the kind of odds that favor you." His scarred face twisted as he tried to reassert control over a situation that had suddenly spiraled beyond his understanding. Matthew's response was a slight shift in position that placed him in perfect alignment with the firing lanes he had spent 2 years preparing. "Interesting thing about odds," he replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had once made him legendary in the Pacific, "is how they change when you understand the battlefield." Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her position with the Winchester, remembering Matthew's lessons about patience and timing. The perfect shot, he had taught her, isn't just about accuracy. It's about understanding when not to take it, about knowing exactly how long to wait. Cole Hawkins, trying to regain the initiative, began a subtle movement toward what he thought was better cover. Whatever you were in the war, old-timer, that was a long time ago. We've got youth and speed on our side. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, waiting for his brother's signal. You know what the Japanese officers used to say about American snipers? Matthews asked, his voice carrying across the sun-baked canyon, that the young ones were dangerous because of their enthusiasm, but the old ones. He let the words hang in the hot air. The old ones were deadly because they'd learned that patience beats speed every time. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted, had begun to understand the full implications of their situation. His eyes darted between the carefully positioned mining equipment, the subtle angles of the terrain, the way every apparent random feature suddenly revealed itself as part of a larger design. Mr. Hawkins, he started again, his voice shaking. Maybe we should— Shut up, boy, Jack snapped. But the command lacked its usual authority. Something about the old miner's stance, the way he seemed to have squared his shoulders without actually moving, had triggered warnings in the gang leader's instincts that he couldn't quite process. Your young friend has good instincts, Matthews observed, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. He's noticing what you should have seen when you rode in, how every piece of equipment, every rock pile, every bit of ground has been arranged precisely, how there's not a single approach to this position that isn't covered. Sarah watched through her spy hole as understanding began to dawn on the Hawkins brothers' faces. They had walked into something far more dangerous than a simple raid on an isolated mining claim. They had entered a killing ground designed by a master of the art, every aspect of their approach anticipated and accounted for. Course waiting. For the perfect shot isn't just about patience, Matthews continued, his voice carrying the same instructional tone he used when teaching Sarah. It's about understanding that sometimes the best target isn't the one in front of you. His eyes flickered briefly to the pile of mining equipment near Cole, causing the younger Hawkins to suddenly realize how exposed his position actually was. Jack Hawkins, desperate to regain control of the situation, attempted to reassert his authority through bravado. You're still just one man, he growled, though his gun hand had developed a slight tremor. However you've set this up, you can't watch every angle. Matthew's smile was slight, but carried the weight of countless battlefield engagements. That's another interesting thing they taught us in the Marines. The value of a well-prepared position isn't just in the primary firing lanes. It's in having support you can trust. His words caused both brothers to suddenly scan the canyon walls, wondering what else they had missed. The tension had reached a critical point. Sarah could see it in the way the Hawkins brothers kept shifting their weight, in the nervous dancing of Tommy's horse, in the subtle changes of angle and position as each man tried to gain some advantage. In a situation that had been orchestrated long before they arrived. Last warning, Matthews offered, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had given similar warnings on other battlefields. Walk away now. Tell your important people that this claim isn't worth the cost. Live to make better choices tomorrow. The offer hung in the superheated air, a final chance at avoiding the inevitable. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews had been built not just on his accuracy with a rifle, but on his ability to control every aspect of an engagement. The Hawkins gang was about to learn why some veterans are remembered not for the battles they fought, but for the ones they won before they ever began. In the suspended moment before violence erupted, as Jack Hawkins struggled with the decision that would determine not just the next few minutes, but the rest of his life, the harsh Nevada sun continued its relentless examination of the canyon. It revealed to those who knew how to look how completely they had walked into a trap laid by a master of his craft. Jack Hawkins' decision crystallized in a burst of desperate action. His revolver flashed in the sunlight as he squeezed the trigger, aiming at where Matthews had been standing just a heartbeat before. But the old prospector had already moved with a fluid grace that belied his apparent age, seeming to flow like water between the carefully positioned mining equipment. The shot echoed off the canyon walls, startling a pair of ravens into flight. Before the sound had fully faded, Matthews had transformed the seemingly random collection of mining equipment into a deadly maze of cover and concealment. His movements displayed none of the trembling weakness that had fooled the Hawkins gang. Instead, they witnessed the lethal precision that had once made him legendary in the Pacific theater. "Interesting choice," Matthews's voice carried across, the claim seeming to come from multiple directions as he used the acoustics of the canyon walls, another carefully planned element of his defense. But not a surprising one. The calm certainty in his tone made even Cole Hawkins' practice swagger falter. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her position with the Winchester, remembering Matthew's lessons about target selection and priority. In any firefight, he had taught her, the most dangerous target isn't always the most obvious one. Sometimes it's the quiet one, the one waiting for others to make the first move. Cole Hawkins, trying to capitalize on his brother's initiative, began working his way toward what he thought was a flanking position. The mining equipment that had seemed randomly scattered now revealed its true purpose, channeling movement, exactly where Matthews wanted it. Each piece had been positioned with the precision of a master chess player, anticipating moves long before they were made. "You know what made the Pacific campaign so different from other wars?" Matthews' voice continued, using conversation as another weapon in his arsenal. "It wasn't just about taking the high ground. It was about understanding how terrain can become a weapon in itself." His words were punctuated by a shot so precise it knocked Cole's gun from his hand before he could fully draw it. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but now frozen in terror, watched as the legend of Ghost Eye Matthews unfolded before him. The old miner seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, each movement calculated, each position offering multiple angles of fire while remaining seemingly exposed. "That's one," Matthews announced, his voice carrying the same instructional tone he used when teaching Sarah. "Would you like to reconsider your position, or should we continue this demonstration?" The offer hung in the air, carrying both promise and warning. Jack Hawkins, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, fired again and again at shadows and glimpses, each shot revealing more about his position than damaging his target. "Cole!" he shouted. "Circle around through the creek bed!" But even as he gave the order, he realized his mistake. "The creek bed," Matthews commented almost conversationally, "makes an interesting study in angles and approaches. Spent quite a bit of time modifying those banks, subtle changes that look natural but serve a very specific purpose." As if to demonstrate, another shot rang out, sending Cole scrambling for cover as the ground near his feet erupted. Sarah watched through her spy hole as the careful preparations of the past 2 years played out exactly as Matthews had planned. Each piece of mining equipment, each pile of tailings, each seemingly random feature of the landscape revealed its true purpose in channeling and controlling movement. "Most folks," Matthews continued, his voice carrying clearly despite the sporadic gunfire, "think precision shooting is all about the moment you pull the trigger. But the real art is in the preparation, in understanding how your target will move, what choices they'll make when pressure hits." Jack Hawkins, his initial confidence completely shattered, found himself pinned down behind a pile of ore that suddenly seemed much less substantial than it had moments before. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice carrying an edge of genuine fear. "What is this place?" Matthew's response was another shot, this one so precise it knocked Jack's hat off without drawing blood. "This place," he replied, is exactly what it appears to be, a carefully prepared position designed by someone who spent years learning how to turn terrain into a weapon. As for who I am, he let the question hang in the air. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews was no longer just a story from distant battlefields. It had come alive in Rattlesnake Canyon, demonstrated not through dramatic charges or bold stands, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's deadliest conflict. Young Tommy Walsh, watching this deadly dance unfold, finally found his voice. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, his words carrying the weight of realization, "we need to leave. This isn't just some old miner. This is something else entirely." His horse, sensing the tension, continued to shift nervously beneath him. The sun had moved slightly, changing the angles of shadow and light across the claim, another factor Matthews had accounted for in his preparations. The Hawkins gang, who had arrived confident in their superiority of numbers and youth, found themselves caught in a web of precisely calculated fields of fire, their every movement anticipated and controlled by a master of his craft. The confrontation in Rattlesnake Canyon had reached a critical phase. Jack Hawkins, his earlier bravado replaced by growing desperation, found himself caught in a position that offered the illusion of cover while actually leaving him exposed to multiple carefully prepared firing lanes. His brother Cole nursed his injured hand, the precision of Matthew's shot having destroyed his weapon without drawing blood, a demonstration of skill that carried its own chilling message. "You're probably wondering," Matthew's voice carried across the claim, still maintaining that unnervingly calm instructional tone, "why I chose this particular canyon, why I spent 2 years preparing this position." Another shot rang out, so precise it severed the strap of Cole's gun belt, causing it to fall useless to the ground. The Japanese had a term for it: living terrain. The idea that a battlefield isn't just ground to be taken, but a living thing that can work with you or against you. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen shifted positions slightly, moving to another pre-prepared observation point. She remembered the hours Matthews had spent teaching her about multiple fields of fire, about how a defensive position wasn't just about where you could shoot from, but about understanding every possible angle of approach. "Mr. Hawkins," Tommy Walsh called out again, his young voice shaking, "he's not trying to kill us, not yet, but I don't think that's going to last much longer." The younger man's assessment of the situation showed an understanding that his employers seemed to lack, the difference between being spared and being toyed with. Jack Hawkins, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension, tried one last time to regain control of the situation. "Whatever they paid you to protect this claim," he shouted, "we can double it, triple it. This isn't about gold, old man. There's something bigger at stake here." Matthew's response was another demonstration of precision, this time a shot that kicked up dirt mere inches from Jack's boot. "Interesting assumption," he replied, his voice now carrying echoes of battlefield command. "That this is about money, that everything can be bought and sold. That's the kind of thinking that creates men like you, and the kind of thinking that made men like me necessary." Sarah watched as Matthews implemented the next phase of his carefully orchestrated plan. Each shot, each movement, each word was designed not just to control the physical battle, but to break down the psychological defenses of men who had built their reputation on intimidation and fear. "You see," Matthews continued, using his voice to draw attention while he moved to another pre-prepared position, "what makes a truly effective defensive position isn't just the physical layout, it's the psychological element. Understanding how your opponent thinks, what choices they'll make under pressure, how they'll react when their usual tactics fail." Cole Hawkins, attempting to reach his brother's position, found himself channeled into another carefully prepared kill zone, A shot rang out, destroying the heel of his boot and sending him scrambling back to his previous cover. "Jack!" he called, out real fear now evident in his voice. "This isn't just some old prospector. This is something else entirely." "The Marines taught us something valuable about combat psychology," Matthew's voice carried across the canyon, still maintaining that eerily calm instructional tone, that the most dangerous moment isn't when your enemy is attacking. It's when they realize that everything they thought they knew about the situation was wrong. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but now frozen in a position that offered no real protection, had become an unwilling student in a master class of tactical warfare. Every aspect of the claim that had seemed random or neglected now revealed itself as part of a carefully crafted design. "Another interesting thing about defensive positions," Matthews continued, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions as he used the canyon's acoustics to his advantage, "is how they can be designed to look vulnerable while actually being nearly impregnable. The Japanese learned that lesson the hard way on several islands." Jack Hawkins, his earlier confidence completely shattered, found himself facing a reality he had never encountered in his years of preying on the seemingly helpless. Every move he considered, every potential action, seemed to have been anticipated and counted long before he arrived. The technical term, Matthews added almost conversationally, is channelization, the art of making your opponent think they're making their own choices while actually controlling every move they make. "Kind of like that mining equipment you thought would provide such good cover, Mr. Hawkins. Took me 3 months to position each piece exactly right." Sarah maintained her position with the Winchester, understanding now why Matthews had spent so many hours teaching her about patience and observation. This wasn't just about defending a mining claim. It was about demonstrating why some predators need to be taught that not all targets are what they appear to be. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews was revealing itself not through dramatic action, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most brutal conflict. The Hawkins gang, who had arrived confident in their ability to intimidate and overwhelm, found themselves caught in a demonstration of why some reputations are earned through precision rather than power. To understand the full weight of what was unfolding in Rattlesnake Canyon, one must step back 2 decades to the blood-soaked islands of the Pacific Theater. Before James Matthews became a solitary prospector seeking non-existent gold, he had been part of an elite Marine Corps unit tasked with developing new methodologies for defensive warfare. "Let me tell you about Okinawa," Matthews' voice carried across the claim, maintaining its unsettling calm as he kept the Hawkins gang pinned in their increasingly precarious positions. "We had this Sergeant, Harrison was his name, taught us something crucial about defensive positions, that the best ones don't look like defenses at all." Jack Hawkins, still desperately seeking some way to regain control of the situation, tried to signal his brother for a coordinated move. But before Cole could even shift his weight, another precision shot kicked up dirt at his feet, freezing him in place. "Harrison had this theory," Matthews continued, using his voice to mask his movement between prepared positions, "that the perfect defensive position should look completely natural, should appear vulnerable while actually controlling every possible approach." A shot punctuated his words, destroying the grip of Jack's revolver without harming his hand. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen watched the methodical dismantling of the Hawkins gang's confidence through her carefully positioned spy holes. Matthews had spent months teaching her about psychological warfare, about how breaking an opponent's will to fight was often more effective than direct confrontation. "The Japanese were masters of defensive fortification," Matthews lectured, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "But they made one crucial mistake. They made their positions obvious, built their bunkers where anyone would expect to find them. Harrison taught us a better way. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted, but now understanding he was witnessing something extraordinary, found himself absorbing the lesson despite his terror. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, his voice shaking, "he's not just shooting at us, he's teaching. That's why we're going to lose." "Interesting observation, young man," Matthews acknowledged. "Most folks think combat is about speed and aggression, but the real art is in control, controlling the space, controlling the timing, controlling your opponent's options until they have only one choice left." Another shot rang out, this one destroying the heel of Jack's boot in a mirror of what he'd done to Cole. Sarah shifted position again, remembering Matthew's lessons about maintaining multiple angles of observation. The Winchester in her hands remained steady, just as he'd taught her, ready but patient, alert but controlled. She watched as the careful preparations of the past 2 years played out exactly as planned. "Take this mining claim, for example," Matthews continued, his voice now seeming to come from a different direction. "Every piece of equipment, every pile of tailings, every apparent sign of neglect has been carefully positioned. Took almost 6 months just to get the angles right, another 3 to weather them so they'd look natural." Cole Hawkins, attempting to reach what he thought was better cover, found himself channeled into another carefully prepared field of fire. A shot rang out, destroying his remaining weapon before he could bring it to bear. "Jack," he called out, real panic now evident. In his voice, "We need to get out of here." "That's the interesting thing about panic," Matthews observed, still maintaining his instructor's tone. "It makes men predictable, makes them forget to look for the subtle signs that would tell them they're being maneuvered into exactly the position their opponent wants them in." The sun had shifted slightly, changing the angles of shadow and light across the claim, another factor Matthews had accounted for in his preparations. The Hawkins gang found themselves caught in an ever-tightening web of precision and control, their every movement anticipated and countered before they could execute it. Harrison used to say that the perfect defensive position was like a well-crafted story, Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon. "Everything appears random and natural on the surface, but underneath, every element serves a specific purpose. Every detail contributes to the final outcome." Jack Hawkins, his earlier bravado completely stripped away, found himself facing a reality he had never encountered in his years of preying on the seemingly helpless. The old prospector they had thought would be an easy target had transformed their supposed raid into a master class in tactical warfare. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews was revealing itself not through dramatic action or bold statements, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most brutal conflict. Each shot, each word, each carefully orchestrated movement demonstrated why some veterans are remembered not for the battles they fought, but for how completely they controlled the battlefield. The atmosphere in Rattlesnake Canyon had transformed from a simple confrontation into a methodical demonstration of tactical superiority. James Matthews continued his calculated dismantling of the Hawkins gang's position, each shot and movement serving multiple purposes in his carefully orchestrated strategy. In the Pacific, Matthews's voice carried across the claim with precise clarity. We learned that superior numbers mean nothing against superior position and preparation. The Japanese discovered this at Peleliu, where a handful of defenders could hold off entire companies if they understood how to use their terrain effectively. Jack Hawkins, now separated from his brother and stripped of his primary weapon, found himself experiencing something entirely new, genuine fear. The precision of Matthews' shots had demonstrated a level of skill that went beyond mere marksmanship. Each round had been placed exactly where intended, destroying weapons and equipment while deliberately avoiding lethal injury. The interesting aspect of defensive warfare, Matthews continued, maintaining his instructional tone, isn't just about stopping an enemy's advance. It's about controlling their options until they have no choice but to accept the situation they've placed themselves in. A shot punctuated his words, destroying the remaining ammunition on Cole's belt with surgical precision. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation of the unfolding scenario. Matthews had educated her extensively on the importance of pattern recognition in combat situations. Every man, he had taught her, no matter how unpredictable they think they are, falls into patterns under stress. The key is identifying those patterns before they do. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but now effectively trapped in place, watched as his employer's confidence crumbled under the relentless psychological and tactical pressure. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of realization. "He's been planning this since before we ever heard of this claim." "Unperceptive observation," Matthews acknowledged. "Most people think combat preparation is about stockpiling ammunition or fortifying positions, but the real preparation happens in understanding your opponent's psychology, knowing how they'll react before they do." Another precisely placed shot severed Jack's gun belt, leaving it to fall uselessly into the dust. The sun continued its arc across the Nevada sky, its harsh light revealing the true nature of Matthew's preparations. What had appeared to be random debris and abandoned equipment now showed itself as an intricately planned network of firing positions and channelized approaches. "Consider this creek bed," Matthews continued, his voice seemingly coming from a new position. "Took nearly 4 months to modify the banks, subtle changes that look like natural erosion, but actually create specific angles of fire and approach. The Japanese were masters at this kind of terrain modification, though they typically made the mistake of making their preparations too obvious." Cole Hawkins, attempting to work his way toward what he thought was a blind spot in Matthews' field, a fire discovered that no such weakness existed. A shot rang out, destroying his remaining backup weapon and leaving him effectively defenseless. "Jack!" he called out, panic evident in his voice. "This isn't just some old man. This is something else entirely." The Marines had a specific term for this type of defensive preparation, Matthews explained, maintaining his unnervingly calm demeanor. They called it total position awareness, the ability to control every aspect of your defensive space, not just physically but psychologically, understanding how terrain, timing, and human nature intersect in combat situations. Sarah shifted to another observation point, noting how Matthews' lessons about multiple angles of coverage were being demonstrated in real time. The Winchester in her hands remained steady, her breath controlled, just as he had taught her during their long hours of preparation. "Another crucial element of defensive warfare," Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with precise clarity, "is understanding the difference between incapacitation and elimination. Sometimes the most effective strategy isn't about how many targets you eliminate, but about how effectively you can neutralize their ability to pose a threat." Jack Hawkins, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, found himself confronting a situation that defied all his previous experience. Every attempt at movement, every planned action, seemed to have been anticipated and counted long before its execution. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice betraying his growing desperation. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews continued to unfold in Rattlesnake Canyon, not through dramatic displays of violence, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most devastating conflict. Each shot, each movement, each carefully chosen word contributed to a masterclass in tactical warfare that the Hawkins gang would never forget, assuming they survived to remember it. The confrontation in Rattlesnake Canyon had evolved into A methodical demonstration of tactical superiority, Matthews continued his systematic dismantling of the Hawkins gang's position while imparting lessons learned in the blood-soaked islands of the Pacific Theater. "Let me tell you about something we learned at Iwo Jima," Matthews' voice carried across the claim with practiced control. The Japanese defenders had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels and fortifications, but their real achievement wasn't in the engineering. It was in how they used psychology to control their opponent's movements. Jack Hawkins, now effectively disarmed and increasingly desperate, found himself experiencing an unfamiliar sensation, the realization that he had completely misread the situation from the beginning. His reputation for brutality and cunning meant nothing against an opponent who had anticipated and prepared for every possible move. "The fascinating thing about defensive warfare," Matthews continued, maintaining his instructional tone, "is that it's not just about stopping an enemy's advance. It's about understanding their thought processes so thoroughly that you can predict and control their reactions." Another precisely placed shot destroyed the last of Cole's backup ammunition, eliminating any possibility of return fire. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen watched through her network of observation points, noting how Matthews' lessons about tactical positioning were being demonstrated in real time. She remembered his teachings about the psychology of combat. The most dangerous opponent isn't the one who acts on impulse, but the one who has planned for every contingency. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but effectively immobilized, had become an unwilling student in this masterclass of tactical warfare. "He's not just defending the claim," he called out to his employers, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. "He's teaching us why we never had a chance from the moment we rode in." "An astute observation," Matthews acknowledged. "Most people think combat effectiveness is about reaction speed or marksmanship. But true mastery comes from controlling the battlefield long before the first shot is fired." His words were punctuated by another demonstration of precision shooting, this time removing Jack's last hidden derringer from its ankle holster. The harsh Nevada sun continued its arc across the sky, its movement changing the shadows and light across the claim, another factor Matthews had accounted for in his preparations. Each passing hour revealed new aspects of his defensive network, showing how completely he had transformed the seemingly random mining site into an intricately planned killing ground. "Consider the placement of these ore carts," Matthews continued, his voice now seeming to come from a different direction. Each one positioned to look abandoned, yet providing specific angles of cover while channeling movement in predetermined patterns. The Japanese would have appreciated the subtlety, though they typically made the mistake of making their preparations too obvious. Cole Hawkins, trying one last desperate attempt to reach what he thought might be a blind spot, found himself channeled into another carefully prepared field of fire. A shot rang out, destroying the heel of his remaining boot and leaving him effectively pinned in place. "Jack!" he called out, real terror now evident in his voice. "We need to find a way out of here." The Marines had a specific term for this kind of situation, Matthews explained, his tone remaining unnervingly calm. They called it tactical inevitability. The point where an opponent realizes that every apparent option for escape or resistance has been methodically eliminated. It's not about the physical barriers as much as the psychological impact of understanding how completely outmaneuvered you are. Sarah shifted position again, maintaining her coverage while observing how Matthews implemented the lessons he had spent months teaching her. The Winchester in her hands remained steady, her breathing controlled, just as he had instructed during their long hours of preparation. "Another crucial aspect of defensive warfare," Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with precise clarity, "is the importance of timing. Not just in terms of when to take a shot, but in understanding how to pace the psychological Breakdown of your opponent's resistance. Jack Hawkins, his earlier confidence completely shattered, found himself facing a reality that defied all his previous experience with violence and intimidation. Every attempt at movement, every planned action seemed to have been anticipated and countered before it could even be attempted. "What kind of man are you?" he called out, his voice betraying his growing desperation. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews continued to unfold in Rattlesnake Canyon, not through dramatic displays of violence, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most devastating conflict. Each shot, each movement, each carefully chosen word contributed to a masterclass in tactical warfare that the Hawkins gang would never forget, assuming they survived to remember it. The confrontation in Rattlesnake Canyon had entered a new phase of psychological warfare. Matthews continued his methodical demonstration while sharing insights gained from his extensive combat experience. His voice carried across the sun-baked terrain with measured precision, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. During the Pacific Campaign, Matthews began, maintaining his position behind a carefully arranged pile of mining equipment, we encountered a Japanese officer who had mastered the art of defensive psychology. He understood that breaking an enemy's will to fight was often more effective than breaking their bodies. Jack Hawkins, now effectively disarmed and increasingly desperate, found his tactical experience utterly inadequate against Matthews' comprehensive strategy. Every attempt to regain control of the situation only served to demonstrate how completely they had been outmaneuvered from the moment they entered the canyon. "The interesting thing about that Japanese officer," Matthews continued, his voice carrying clearly, despite the occasional echo off the canyon walls, "was how he used time itself as a weapon. He understood that prolonged uncertainty, combined with demonstrations of precise control, could accomplish what direct confrontation often couldn't." Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. Matthews had spent countless hours teaching her about the psychological aspects of combat. "The mind," he had told her, "often surrenders long before the body, if you know how to apply pressure correctly." Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but effectively immobilized, had become an unwitting student of advanced tactical warfare. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, his voice trembling, "he's not just controlling where we can move, he's controlling how we think about moving." "Perceptive observation," Matthews acknowledged. "Combat effectiveness isn't just about physical positioning. It's about understanding how your opponent's mind works under pressure, how they process options and make decisions when their usual patterns fail." Another precisely placed shot destroyed the last piece of Cole's remaining equipment, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the mining claim, revealing the true sophistication of Matthews' preparations. What had appeared to be random debris and abandoned equipment now showed itself as an intricately planned network of firing positions and psychological triggers. "Consider your current situation," Matthews continued, his voice now seeming to emanate from a different location. "Every move you've made since entering this canyon has been channeled into predetermined positions. Each attempt to regain tactical advantage has only served to demonstrate how completely your options have been limited." Cole Hawkins, making one final attempt to find an escape route, discovered that even his retreat had been anticipated and prepared for. A shot rang out, destroying his last means of communication, a signal whistle he had kept hidden in his vest pocket. "Jack!" he called out, panic evident in his voice. "He's been 2 steps ahead of us the whole time." The Marines had a specific term for this kind of comprehensive tactical control, Matthews explained, maintaining his unnervingly calm demeanor. "They called it absolute domain awareness. the ability to control not just physical space, but the psychological and temporal aspects of combat as well. Sarah shifted to another observation point, noting how Matthew's lessons about maintaining multiple angles of coverage were being demonstrated with lethal precision. The Winchester in her hands remained ready, her breathing controlled, just as he had taught her during their months of preparation. Another crucial element of psychological warfare, Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with measured clarity, is understanding the importance of demonstration versus elimination. Sometimes the most effective strategy isn't about how many targets you eliminate, but about how thoroughly you can demonstrate their vulnerability. Jack Hawkins, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, found himself confronting a situation that defied all his previous experience with violence and intimidation. Every attempt at movement, every planned action seemed to have been anticipated and countered long before its execution. "What do you want from us?" he called out, his voice betraying his growing desperation. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews continued to unfold in Rattlesnake Canyon, not through dramatic displays of violence, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most devastating conflict. Each shot, each movement, each carefully chosen word contributed to a masterclass in tactical warfare that the Hawkins gang would never forget if they survived to remember it. The confrontation in Rattlesnake Canyon had evolved into a masterclass in tactical psychology. Matthews continued his systematic demonstration while sharing insights gained from his years of combat experience. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mining claim, each passing hour revealing new aspects of his intricate preparations. In the Pacific Theater, Matthews's voice carried across the claim with measured precision, we learned that the most effective defensive positions weren't the ones with the best fortifications. They were the ones that could break an enemy's will to fight before direct confrontation became necessary. Jack Hawkins, now effectively disarmed and increasingly desperate, found himself experiencing a profound shift in perspective. The confident predator who had terrorized 3 territories was being systematically transformed into prey, and the realization was having a visible effect on his composure. The Japanese defenders at Saipan, Matthews continued, maintaining his instructional tone, had an interesting philosophy about defensive warfare. They believed that the perfect defense wasn't about preventing an enemy's advance, but about making them question every step they took. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. She remembered Matthew's teachings about the psychological aspects of combat. The difference between a good defensive position and a perfect one isn't in the physical barriers. It's in how thoroughly you can control your opponent's decision-making process. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but effectively immobilized, had become an unwitting student of advanced tactical warfare. He's not just demonstrating his control, he called out to his employers, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. He's making us feel what it's like to be completely powerless. An astute observation, Matthews acknowledged. Most people think combat effectiveness is about superior firepower or tactical advantage, but true mastery comes from understanding how to break down an opponent's psychological defenses systematically. Another precisely placed shot destroyed the last of Cole's remaining equipment. The harsh Nevada sun continued its relentless examination of the canyon, revealing the true sophistication of Matthew's preparations. What had appeared to be a random collection of mining equipment now showed itself as an intricately planned network of psychological and tactical triggers. Consider your current situation, Matthews continued, his voice now seeming to come from a different direction. Every attempt to regain control has only served to demonstrate how completely your options have been limited. Each move you make reveals another layer of preparation you hadn't anticipated. Cole Hawkins, making one final attempt to find an escape route, discovered that even his retreat had been carefully channeled into predetermined positions. A shot rang out, destroying his last hidden weapon, a small derringer concealed in his boot. "Jack!" he called out, real terror now evident in his voice. "We need to accept that we're beaten." The Marines had a specific term for this kind of psychological dominance, Matthews explained, maintaining his unnervingly calm demeanor. They called it complete spectrum control, the ability to dominate not just physical space, but the mental and emotional aspects of combat as well. Sarah shifted to another observation point, noting how Matthews' lessons about maintaining multiple angles of coverage were being demonstrated with lethal precision. The Winchester in her hands remained ready, her breathing controlled just as he had taught her during their months of preparation. Another crucial element of psychological warfare, Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with measured clarity, is understanding the importance of timing. It's not just about when to take action, but about how to pace the breakdown of your opponent's resistance. Jack Hawkins, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, found himself confronting a situation that defied all his previous experience. With violence and intimidation, every attempt at movement, every planned action, seemed to have been anticipated and countered long before its execution. "What do you want from us?" he called out, his voice betraying his growing desperation. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews continued to unfold in Rattlesnake Canyon, not through dramatic displays of violence, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most devastating conflict. Each shot, each movement, each carefully chosen word contributed to a masterclass in tactical warfare that the Hawkins gang would never forget, assuming they survived to remember it. The confrontation had moved beyond simple physical dominance into a deeper realm of psychological warfare. Matthews wasn't just demonstrating his superior tactical position, he was systematically breaking down the gang's understanding of their own capabilities and control. The confrontation in Rattlesnake Canyon had entered its final phase. The afternoon. Sun cast lengthening shadows across the mining claim as James Matthews continued his methodical demonstration of tactical superiority. The transformation of the Hawkins gang from confident predators to desperate prey was nearly complete. During the Battle of Okinawa, Matthews' voice carried across the claim with measured precision. We encountered a Japanese commander who understood something profound about defensive warfare. He knew that the moment of surrender isn't marked by weapons being laid down. It begins in the mind, when men finally understand the full depth of their tactical disadvantage. Jack Hawkins, stripped of his weapons and trademark confidence, stood exposed in the harsh Nevada sunlight. The scarred face that had terrorized 3 territories now showed something new, the dawning realization that he had severely miscalculated his position from the very beginning. Your reputation preceded you, Mr. Hawkins, Matthews continued, his voice maintaining its instructional tone. Stories of how you systematically targeted those who appeared vulnerable, how you used fear and intimidation to control your victims. But you never stopped to consider that someone might use those same tactics against you. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. Through her carefully positioned spy hole, she watched as Matthews implemented the final phase of his psychological strategy. This was the culmination of everything he had taught her about the true nature of combat. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but effectively trapped, had become an unwitting witness to a masterclass in tactical warfare. "Mr. Hawkins," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "He's not just defeating us. He's making sure we understand why we were defeated before we ever arrived." "A perceptive observation," Matthews acknowledged. "The most effective victory isn't just about physical dominance. It's about ensuring your opponent comprehends the completeness of their defeat so thoroughly that they never consider similar actions again." Another precisely placed shot destroyed the last of Jack's hidden equipment. The sun continued its westward journey, its harsh light revealing new aspects of Matthews's preparations. Each shadow, each angle, each seemingly random feature of the mining claim showed itself as part of an intricately planned network of psychological and tactical triggers. "Consider your current situation," Matthews continued, his voice now emanating from a different position. "Every move you've made since entering this canyon has been anticipated and countered. Each attempt to regain control has only served to demonstrate how completely your options were limited from the beginning. Cole Hawkins, making one final desperate attempt to find an advantage, discovered that even his thoughts of escape had been predicted and prepared for. A shot rang out, destroying his remaining means of communication, a small mirror used for signaling distant accomplices. "Jack," he called out, real fear evident in his voice. "He knows everything about our operation." "The Marines had a term for this level of tactical preparation," Matthews explained, maintaining his unnervingly calm demeanor. "They called it complete battlefield awareness, the ability to understand and control not just physical space but every aspect of your opponent's decision-making process." Sarah shifted to another observation point, noting how Matthews's lessons about maintaining multiple angles of coverage were being demonstrated with lethal precision. She remembered his teachings about the psychology of combat. The perfect victory isn't achieved through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of human nature. "Another crucial element of psychological warfare," Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with measured clarity, "is understanding the importance of revelation. It's not enough to defeat your opponent. They must understand why they were defeated so thoroughly that the lesson becomes permanent." Jack Hawkins, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, found himself confronting a reality that defied all his previous experience with violence and intimidation. Every attempt at resistance, every planned action, had been anticipated and countered long before its execution. "Who are you really?" he called out, his voice betraying his complete psychological surrender. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews was reaching its culmination in Rattlesnake Canyon, not through dramatic displays of violence, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most devastating conflict. Each shot, each movement, each carefully chosen word contributed to a lesson that would reshape the Hawkins gang's understanding of power and vulnerability. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Rattlesnake Canyon as the confrontation approached its inevitable conclusion. James Matthews had systematically stripped away not just the Hawkins gang's weapons, but their entire understanding of power and control. "In the Pacific," Matthews' voice carried across the claim with measured precision, "we learned that the most decisive victories weren't won through superior firepower. They were won through superior understanding of human psychology. The Japanese commanders who gave us the most trouble weren't the ones with the most men or weapons. They were the ones who understood how to break their enemy's will to fight." Jack Hawkins stood exposed in the harsh light, his scarred face showing the complete transformation from predator to prey. The man who had terrorized 3 territories with his brutality now understood what true tactical superiority felt like from the other side. "Your greatest mistake," Matthews continued, maintaining his instructional tone, "wasn't in choosing this claim as a target. It wasn't even in underestimating my capabilities. Your greatest mistake was in believing that power comes from the ability to intimidate those weaker than yourself. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. Through her network of carefully positioned spy holes, she watched as Matthews implemented the final phase of his tactical demonstration. Every lesson he had taught her about combat psychology was being displayed with lethal precision. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but effectively immobilized, had become an unwitting student of advanced warfare. "He's not just showing us how completely we were outmaneuvered," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. "He's making sure we never forget the lesson." "An astute observation," Matthews acknowledged. "The most effective deterrent isn't fear of death or injury. It's the complete understanding of how thoroughly you can be controlled by someone who has prepared more carefully than you have." Another, precisely placed shot destroyed the last piece of Jack's remaining equipment. The sun's position had shifted significantly, creating new patterns of light and shadow across the mining claim. Each change in illumination revealed another aspect of Matthew's intricate preparations, showing how completely he had transformed the terrain into a weapon of psychological warfare. "Consider your current situation," Matthews continued, his voice now seeming to emanate from a different location. "Every action you've taken since entering this canyon has been anticipated and countered. Each attempt to regain control has only served to demonstrate how completely your options were limited from the beginning." Cole Hawkins, making one final desperate attempt to understand their situation, found even his thoughts being predicted and addressed. A shot rang out, destroying his last hidden resource, a small compass concealed in his belt buckle. "Jack," he called out, terror evident in his voice. "He's not just beating us, he's teaching us something." The Marines had a specific philosophy about this kind of tactical education, Matthews explained, maintaining his unnervingly calm demeanor. They believed that the most valuable lessons aren't taught through words, but through experience, through the kind of understanding that comes only from complete tactical and psychological defeat. Sarah shifted to another observation point, noting how Matthew's lessons about maintaining multiple angles of coverage were being demonstrated with methodical precision. She remembered his teachings about the final phase of combat. The moment of true victory isn't when your opponent can no longer fight. It's when they understand why they should never have started the fight in the first place. Another crucial element of psychological warfare, Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with measured clarity, is understanding the importance of timing, knowing exactly when to deliver the final lesson, when your opponent is most ready to receive it. Jack Hawkins, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, found himself experiencing something entirely new, genuine humility. Every attempt at resistance, every planned action, had been anticipated and countered so thoroughly that resistance itself seemed pointless. "What happens now?" he called out, his voice betraying his complete psychological surrender. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews was reaching its culmination in Rattlesnake Canyon, not through dramatic displays of violence, but through the methodical application of skills honed in humanity's most devastating conflict. Each shot, each movement, each carefully chosen word contributed to a lesson that would reshape the Hawkins gang's understanding of power and vulnerability forever. The late afternoon sun hung low over Rattlesnake Canyon as the confrontation entered its final moments. James Matthews had systematically demonstrated not just his tactical superiority, but a deeper understanding of how to transform violence into education. In the closing days of the Pacific Campaign, Matthews' voice carried across the claim with measured precision. We encountered a Japanese commander who understood something profound about the nature of conflict. He knew that the most lasting victory isn't achieved through destruction, but through transformation. Jack Hawkins stood motionless in the fading light, his scarred face showing the complete evolution of his understanding. The brutal confidence that had marked his reign of terror across 3 territories had been replaced by something approaching wisdom, hard-earned and unwanted, but undeniable. "Your reputation for violence," Matthews continued, maintaining. His instructional tone was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of power. "You believed that strength came from the ability to inflict suffering. The past few hours have demonstrated how incomplete that understanding was." Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. Through her carefully positioned spy holes, she watched as Matthews brought his tactical demonstration to its carefully planned conclusion. Every lesson he had taught her about the psychology of combat was being displayed in real time. "The most interesting thing about combat psychology," Matthews explained, his voice carrying clearly despite the growing evening shadows, "is how it reveals the true nature of those involved. Strip away the weapons, the bravado, the illusion of control. What remains is the real person beneath." Cole Hawkins, all pretense of resistance now abandoned, found himself nodding in unwilling agreement. "He's right, Jack," he called out, his voice carrying a new kind of understanding. "Everything we thought we knew about power and control, it was all backward." The Marines had a specific term for this kind of tactical education, Matthews continued, his tone remaining measured and calm. "They called it fundamental transformation, the process by which an opponent's entire understanding of conflict and power is completely reshaped through direct experience." Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but now an eager student rather than a trapped participant, watched as the final phase of Matthews's demonstration unfolded. "He's giving us a chance," he called out, comprehension dawning in his voice, "not just to survive, but to understand." The sun's position cast long shadows across the mining claim, each one revealing another aspect of Matthew's intricate preparations. What had seemed like random features of the landscape now showed themselves as components of a carefully crafted lesson in tactical warfare. "Consider what you've learned today," Matthews continued, his voice now emanating from a new position. "Every attempt at violence was met with precise control. Every effort to dominate was transformed into a demonstration of your own vulnerability. These aren't just tactical lessons. They're fundamental truths about the nature of power itself." Sarah shifted to another observation point, remembering Matthews's teachings about the final phase of combat psychology. The moment of true victory isn't marked by surrender, but by understanding. When your opponent comprehends not just their defeat, but the fundamental flaws in their approach to power. "The most valuable aspect of this experience," Matthews explained, maintaining his role as instructor, "isn't in the demonstration of superior tactical position or marksmanship. It's in the opportunity to understand why your approach to power was fundamentally flawed from the beginning." Jack Hawkins, his transformation from predator to student now complete, found himself experiencing a profound shift in perspective. "All this time," he called out, his voice carrying genuine realization, "we thought we were the powerful ones, but real power isn't about causing fear, it's about understanding how to control it." The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews had manifested itself in Rattlesnake Canyon not as a tale of violence and revenge, but as a masterclass in the true nature of power and control. Each shot, each movement, each carefully chosen word had contributed to a lesson that would reshape not just the Hawkins gang's understanding, but their entire approach to existence. The transformation that had taken place in that sun-baked canyon went beyond simple tactical defeat. Matthews had not just outmaneuvered his opponents, he had fundamentally altered their understanding of power, control, and the true nature of strength. The lesson, bought with fear and humiliation but paid for with understanding, would last far longer than any physical wounds could have. The transformation in Rattlesnake Canyon was nearing completion as the sun began its final descent toward the western horizon. James Matthews had orchestrated not just a tactical victory, but a profound shift in understanding that would reshape the lives of everyone involved. Before we conclude this lesson, Matthews' voice carried across the claim with measured precision. There's something important you should understand about why you're still alive. In the Pacific, we learned that sometimes the most powerful message isn't sent through death, but through the deliberate choice to preserve life. Jack Hawkins stood in the fading light, his scarred face showing a complex mixture of emotions. The brutal confidence that had defined his existence had been replaced by something more valuable, genuine understanding. "You could have killed us at any time," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Of course," Matthews acknowledged, maintaining his instructional tone. "But death is final, and dead men can't learn, can't change, can't carry the lesson to others who might need to hear it." Another precisely placed shot rang out, this one destroying the last hidden token of the gang's former life, a golden medallion Jack had taken from his first victim. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. Through her network of spy holes, she watched as Matthews implemented the final phase of his tactical demonstration. This was the culmination of everything he had taught her about the true purpose of combat skill. "The most valuable victory," Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with measured clarity, "isn't in eliminating your opponents. It's in transforming them into living examples of why certain paths should not be taken, certain choices should not be made." Cole Hawkins, his own transformation from predator to student now complete, found himself nodding in agreement. "All those people we terrorized," he called out, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "We thought we were demonstrating strength, but we were just showing our own weakness." The Marines had a philosophy about this kind of situation, Matthews explained, maintaining his calm demeanor. They believed that the most effective deterrent isn't the enemy you eliminate, but the one you send back to spread the word about why certain actions are unwise. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but now an eager participant in this final phase of instruction, watched as understanding spread across his former employers' faces. "This isn't just about us, is it?" he called out. "This is about everyone who might follow our path." The sun's position cast long shadows across the mining claim, each one revealing another aspect of Matthew's intricate preparation. What had seemed like random features of the landscape now showed themselves as components of a carefully crafted lesson in the true nature of power and responsibility. "Consider your future options," Matthews continued, his voice now emanating from a new position. "You can return to your former ways, though I suspect you'll find that path significantly less appealing now. Or you can take this lesson, this understanding you've gained at such cost, and use it to make different choices." Sarah shifted to another observation point, remembering Matthew's teachings about the final phase of combat psychology. The most profound victory isn't in defeating your enemy, but in giving them the opportunity to become something better than they were. "The choice I'm offering you," Matthews explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "isn't just about walking away from this canyon. It's about walking away from everything that led you here. The violence, the intimidation, the fundamental misunderstanding of what true strength means." Jack Hawkins, his transformation now complete, found himself facing a choice he had never anticipated. "How?" he called out, his voice carrying genuine uncertainty. "Does a man come back from being what we've been?" The legend of Ghost Eye, Matthews had manifested itself in Rattlesnake Canyon, not as a story of revenge or retribution, but as a lesson in the possibility of transformation. Each shot, each word, each carefully orchestrated moment had contributed to a demonstration of how complete tactical superiority could be used not to destroy, but to rebuild. The change that had taken place in that sun-baked canyon went beyond simple defeat. Matthews had not just overpowered his opponents, he had given them the opportunity to understand why their approach to power had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The lesson, bought with fear and humiliation, but paid for with understanding, would ripple outward far beyond the confines of Rattlesnake Canyon. As twilight began to settle over Rattlesnake Canyon, James Matthews prepared to deliver the final phase of his carefully orchestrated lesson. The transformation of the Hawkins gang from feared predators to humbled students was nearly complete, but the most important part of their education still remained. In the final days of the Pacific campaign, Matthews' voice carried across the claim with measured precision, I learned something crucial about the nature of victory. The Japanese commander who finally surrendered to our unit didn't do so because we'd destroyed his ability to fight. He surrendered because we'd shown him a better way to live. Jack Hawkins stood in the fading light, his scarred face showing, a depth of understanding that had been painfully earned. All these years, he called out, his voice carrying genuine revelation, we thought we were the strong ones. But real strength isn't about making others fear you. No, Matthews acknowledged, maintaining his instructional tone. Real strength is about understanding the responsibility that comes with power, about knowing when to use it, and more importantly, when not to. Another precisely placed shot rang out, this one destroying the gang's last symbol of their former life, their gang insignia carved into Cole's saddle. Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her vigilant observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. Through her carefully positioned spy holes, she watched as Matthews brought his tactical demonstration to its final, crucial phase. This was the moment he had prepared her for, when victory transforms into opportunity. The most valuable lesson from war, Matthews continued, his voice carrying across the canyon with measured clarity, isn't about how to fight effectively. It's about understanding why fighting should always be the last resort, not the first choice. Cole Hawkins, his own transformation evident in his bearing, found himself confronting uncomfortable truths. We've been following the wrong path for so long, he called out, his voice carrying genuine remorse. How does a man find his way back from that? The Marines had a saying about redemption, Matthews explained, maintaining his calm demeanor. They believed that the measure of a man isn't in how far he's fallen, but in how hard he's willing to work to climb back up. Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but now an eager participant in this final lesson, watched as understanding deepened across his former employers' faces. This isn't just about changing what we do, is it? He called out. It's about changing who we are. The sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, the changing light revealing final aspects of Matthew's intricate preparation. What had begun as a tactical demonstration had evolved into something far more profound, a lesson in the possibility of personal transformation. Consider your path forward, Matthews continued, his voice now emanating from a new position. The territorial marshal will be arriving soon. The evidence of your past crimes is substantial, but your future, that remains unwritten. Sarah shifted to another observation point, remembering Matthew's teachings about the final phase of rehabilitation. The most profound change doesn't come from fear of punishment, but from genuine understanding of why change is necessary. The choice before you now, Matthews explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience, isn't just about accepting the consequences of your past actions. It's about deciding what kind of men you want to be moving forward. Jack Hawkins. His transformation from feared outlaw to humbled student complete found himself facing possibilities he had never considered. "We owe debts that can't be repaid," he called out, his voice carrying genuine understanding. "Lives we've taken, families we've destroyed." The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews had manifested itself in Rattlesnake Canyon not as a story of vengeance, but as a testament to the possibility of redemption. Each shot, each word, each carefully orchestrated moment had contributed to a demonstration of how complete tactical superiority could be used not to destroy, but to rebuild. The transformation that had taken place in that sun-baked canyon went beyond simple defeat or surrender. Matthews had not just overpowered his opponents, he had given them the opportunity to understand why their approach to life had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The lesson, bought with fear and humiliation, but paid for with understanding, would continue to shape their lives long after they left Rattlesnake Canyon. As the last light of day painted the western sky, the sound of approaching horses signaled the arrival of the territorial marshal and his deputies. The time for lessons was ending, but the real test, the challenge of living up to their newfound understanding, was just beginning. The arrival of Marshal Jenkins and his deputies brought the final phase of Matthews' lesson into sharp focus. The sun's last rays painted Rattlesnake Canyon in deepening shades of purple and gold, a fitting backdrop for the conclusion of this carefully orchestrated demonstration. "Before the law takes its course," Matthews's voice carried across the claim, "with measured precision, there's one final lesson from the Pacific that might serve you well. The Japanese soldiers who survived the war didn't just lay down their weapons, they had to learn how to rebuild their lives with honor, even while accepting the consequences of their actions." Jack Hawkins stood motionless as the lawman approached, his scarred face showing a complex mixture of resignation and newfound purpose. The transformation from feared outlaw to someone capable of redemption had been painful, but undeniably complete. "The interesting thing about justice," Matthews continued, maintaining his instructional tone, "is that it's not just about punishment. It's about restoration, about finding ways to balance the debt you owe society with the potential to become something better than what you were." Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen maintained her disciplined observation, the Winchester steady in her hands. Through her network of spy holes, she watched as Matthews orchestrated the final moments of his tactical demonstration. This was the culmination of everything he had taught her about the true purpose of power. "The most valuable aspect of surrender," Matthews explained, his voice carrying across the canyon with measured clarity, "isn't in the act itself, but in how you carry yourself afterward. Every choice from this point forward will either validate or waste the lessons you've learned today." Marshal Jenkins dismounted, his experienced eyes taking in the scene before him. The notorious Hawkins gang, known for their brutality across 3 territories, stood disarmed and transformed. "Quite a situation you've handled here, Matthews," he called out, his voice carrying both respect and curiosity. "The Marines had a philosophy about moments like this," Matthews responded, maintaining his calm demeanor. "They believed that the true test of a victory isn't in the moment of triumph, but in what grows from the ashes of defeat." Cole Hawkins, his own transformation evident in his bearing, addressed the marshal directly. "We're prepared to face the consequences," he called out, his voice carrying genuine acceptance. "But we'd like the chance to make something better of ourselves, even if it's behind bars." Young Tommy Walsh, still mounted but now fully understanding his role in this transformative moment, watched as the deputies began securing his former employers. "The lessons we learned here," he said quietly, They're worth more than any gold we might have found. The last light of day cast long shadows across the mining claim, each one a reminder of how completely Matthews had controlled every aspect of this confrontation. What had begun as a simple attempt at robbery had evolved into something far more profound, a lesson in the possibility of human transformation. "Consider this moment carefully," Matthews continued, his voice now carrying the weight of final instruction. "The choices you make in accepting your punishment, in how you conduct yourselves moving forward, they'll determine whether today's lessons take root or wither away." Sarah shifted to her final observation point, remembering Matthew's teachings about the conclusion of combat psychology. The most profound victory isn't in defeating your enemy, but in helping them find a better path forward, even through the consequences of their actions. "What you do with this understanding," Matthews explained, addressing the gang one final time, "will matter more than any skill with a gun or reputation for violence ever did. True strength lies not in avoiding punishment, but in accepting it as part of the path to becoming better men." Jack Hawkins, as the deputies secured his hands, found himself facing a future he had never imagined. "We won't waste this chance," he called out to Matthews, his voice carrying genuine conviction. "Whatever time we serve, we'll use it to find a way to make amends." The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews had manifested itself in Rattlesnake Canyon, not as a tale of revenge or retribution, but as a testament to the possibility of redemption through understanding. Each shot, each word, each carefully orchestrated moment had contributed to a demonstration of how complete tactical superiority could be used not to destroy, but to rebuild. The transformation that had taken place in that sun-baked canyon went beyond simple defeat or surrender. Matthews had not just overpowered his opponents, he had given them the opportunity to understand why their approach to life had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The lesson, bought with fear and humiliation but paid for with understanding, would continue to shape their lives long after they left Rattlesnake Canyon. The sun had fully set over Rattlesnake Canyon as Marshal Jenkins and his deputies prepared to depart with their prisoners. In the deepening twilight, the mining claim began to reveal its true nature, not just as a tactical masterpiece, but as a testament to the possibility of transformation through understanding. "Before you ride out," Matthew's voice carried across the claim one final time, "there's something else we learned in the Pacific worth remembering. The most lasting victories aren't marked by what's destroyed, but by what's rebuilt from the ruins." Jack Hawkins, now secured in the marshal's custody, stood straighter despite his bonds. The scarred face that had once terrorized 3 territories now showed something entirely new, purpose born from understanding. "We'll remember," he said, quietly, his voice carrying genuine conviction. "Every lesson, every shot that could have killed but didn't, every chance you gave us to understand." "The interesting thing about redemption," Matthews continued, maintaining his instructional tone even as the deputies secured their prisoners, "is that it's not a single moment of change, but a continuous series of choices. Each day brings new opportunities to prove that the transformation is genuine." Inside the cabin, Sarah Chen finally lowered the Winchester, watching through her spy hole, as the final act of this carefully orchestrated demonstration played out. Matthews had taught her that the most important moment in any confrontation wasn't the victory itself, but what came after. "Consider your time in custody," Matthews explained, his voice carrying across the cooling evening air, "not as punishment alone, but as an opportunity. Every day will present choices, chances to either reinforce what you've learned here or fall back into old patterns." Marshal Jenkins, a veteran of countless arrests, recognized something unusual in the demeanor of his prisoners. "In all my years enforcing the law," he observed, "I've never seen men so thoroughly changed by a single encounter." The Marines had a saying about transformation, Matthews responded, still maintaining his role as instructor. They believed that true change happens not in a single moment of revelation, but through the accumulated weight of understanding gained at great cost. Cole Hawkins, securing his position in the prison wagon, addressed his former victims who had gathered to witness justice being served. "We can't undo what we've done," he called out, his voice carrying genuine remorse, "but we can spend the rest of our lives trying to balance the scales." Young Tommy Walsh, the youngest of the prisoners, watched as the mining claim that had been their intended target transformed back into its disguise of peaceful insignificance. "The gold we came for wasn't in the ground," he said softly. "It was in the lessons we learned here." The evening stars began to appear above Rattlesnake Canyon, their light revealing the final aspects of Matthew's intricate preparation. What had seemed like a simple mining claim now showed itself as something far more valuable, a place where lives could be transformed through carefully applied wisdom. "Remember this canyon," Matthews continued, his voice carrying into the gathering darkness. "Not for the defeat you experienced here, but for the understanding you gained. Every shot that spared your lives was an investment in what you might become." Sarah moved to her final observation post, recalling Matthew's teachings about the aftermath of conflict. The true measure of victory isn't in how completely you defeat your opponent, but in how thoroughly you can transform their understanding of themselves. "Your future," Matthews explained, addressing the prisoners one final time, "will be determined not by your past actions, but by how you choose to move forward from this moment. The territory's prisons are full of men who never learned these lessons. Make sure you prove yourselves different." Jack Hawkins, as the prison wagon prepared to depart, made one final statement that proved the completeness of his transformation. "We came here thinking we were the powerful ones," he called out, "but you showed us what real power looks like, the power to change lives instead of ending them." The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews had manifested itself in Rattlesnake Canyon, not as a story of violence and retribution, but as a testament to the possibility of redemption through understanding. Each moment of the confrontation, from the first shot to the final surrender, had served a purpose greater than simple victory. As Marshal Jenkins and his deputies prepared for their journey to the territorial prison, the true nature of Matthews' victory became clear. He hadn't just defeated the Hawkins gang, he had transformed them, giving them the tools and understanding necessary to rebuild their lives, even from behind prison walls. The transformation that had taken place in that sun-baked canyon would continue to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the immediate participants. The lesson, bought with fear and humiliation, but paid for with understanding, would serve as a testament to the possibility of genuine change, even in the most hardened hearts. The full moon rose over Rattlesnake Canyon, casting silver light across the mining claim that had witnessed such profound transformation. As the dust settled from the departing prison wagon, James Matthews and Sarah Chen stood on the cabin's porch, reflecting on the events that had reshaped not just lives, but understanding itself. "You know what the hardest lesson was in the Pacific?" Matthews spoke softly, his voice no longer carrying the quaver he had used as part of his disguise. Not the combat techniques or survival skills. It was learning that true strength lies not in how many lives you can take, but in how many you can transform. Sarah placed the Winchester carefully in its rack, remembering how the events of the day had demonstrated everything Matthews had taught her over the past 2 years. "Will they really change?" she asked, her young voice carrying both hope and skepticism. "The interesting thing about profound lessons," Matthews replied, his eyes scanning the now quiet canyon, "is that once truly understood, they can't be unlearned. The Hawkins gang came here thinking they understood power. They left knowing how little they actually knew." The night wind carried the scent of sage and cooling rock through the canyon, softly stirring the same dust devils that had greeted the gang's arrival hours earlier. But now, like everything else in the canyon, they seemed to carry different meaning. The Marines had a term for what happened today, Matthews continued, resuming his role as teacher one final time. They called it complete tactical education, when an opponent learns not just that they were defeated, but why their entire approach to power was fundamentally flawed. Sarah moved to check their defensive positions, a habit Matthews had instilled in her through countless hours of training. "You never intended to kill them, did you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. From the very first shot, this was about teaching rather than destroying. "Most folks think combat effectiveness is about how many targets you can eliminate," Matthews explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But the true test of mastery is in how many lives you can change while using the minimum force necessary." The moonlight revealed the subtle modifications Matthews had made to the mining claim over 2 years of patient preparation. Each feature that had appeared random by day now showed its true purpose in the silvery light, a testament to the power of careful planning and deeper understanding. "Consider what the Hawkins gang learned today," Matthews continued, gesturing to the now empty canyon. "Not just about tactical superiority or combat psychology, but about the very nature of power itself. They arrived thinking strength came from causing fear. They left understanding that true power lies in having the ability to destroy but choosing not to." Sarah remembered watching through her spy holes as the transformation took place, seeing hardened criminals gradually transform into students of a deeper wisdom. "It was like watching them wake up from a dream," she observed, "or maybe wake up from a nightmare they'd been living." "The most valuable victory," Matthews responded, nodding in agreement, "isn't in defeating your enemy, but in helping them understand why they never needed to be your enemy in the first place. The Japanese commander who taught me that survived the war to become one of the strongest advocates for peace." The night deepened around them, the stars appearing one by one above the canyon walls. What had been a battlefield hours before had transformed back into a quiet mining claim, though now it carried new meaning for those who understood its true purpose. "Tomorrow," Matthews said, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction, "we'll begin restoring the claim to its defensive readiness. Every piece of equipment, every angle of coverage, every prepared position needs to be checked and adjusted. The lesson we taught today might need to be taught again." Sarah nodded, understanding that their work was far from over. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews wasn't just about tactical superiority or combat skill. It was about the patient application of wisdom earned through hard experience, used not to destroy but to transform. "The most important thing I learned in the Pacific," Matthews concluded as they prepared to retire for the night, "wasn't how to take lives efficiently. It was understanding that the greatest victory comes not from destroying your enemies, but from transforming them into something better than they were." The legend that had unfolded in Rattlesnake Canyon that day would spread far beyond its rocky walls, not as a tale of violence and revenge, but as a story of transformation and possibility. Each shot that had been fired, each word that had been spoken, each moment of carefully orchestrated instruction had served a purpose greater than simple victory. The moon continued its arc across the Nevada sky, casting ever-changing shadows across the mining claim that had witnessed such profound change. The legend of Ghost Eye Matthews would live on, not through tales of death and destruction, but through the stories of lives transformed by understanding earned at great cost. In the end, the true gold in Rattlesnake Canyon hadn't been the kind that could be panned from its streams or dug from its rocks. It had been the wisdom passed from a veteran sharpshooter to those who needed it most, even if they hadn't known they needed it when they arrived. The lessons taught that day would continue to shape lives long after the desert winds had erased all other traces of the confrontation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't. Want to pass these up? Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.